coming out. There's a lot of parents in the audience, which is fabulous because that's really who we were working to engage tonight. My name is Paul McNeil. I'm the coalition coordinator for the Northampton Prevention Coalition. Karen Jarvis-Vance is our director. She's in the very back. I think there she is. She's our director. I'm the coordinator. We have a youth engagement coordinator, Ananda Lennox. She's phenomenal. She works with 2 groups at Smith Voc and NHS, and she works a little bit at JFK as well. Tonight we thought we're going to bring Rick Cresta over because Rick has a really, really great way of talking about a very important substance here in Northampton, because our middle and high school youth use rates, 30-day use rates, they report about every 2 years, our 8th, 10th, and 12th graders in Northampton, across many, many, many areas of their life: alcohol use, marijuana use, tobacco use, risky behavior, positive behavior, connection to school, all sorts of wonderful tidbits. And Northampton middle and high schoolers' cumulative rate of 30-day marijuana use is about 60% higher than the national average. So we have already a bit of a problem with marijuana use in Northampton, and it's a very contentious issue because of all the legislative shifts that have happened as well, and legal shifts. And Rick has an amazing way of sort of non-judgmentally talking about this subject with the youth in mind and with the best interest of young people in mind, and also how to advocate for parents in communicating with their children about a really complicated and challenging subject. It's kind of changing every week, it seems. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Rick Cresta from Boston University.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. All right, I'm really glad to be here tonight to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that's marijuana. I talk about it a lot, actually, not just doing trainings like this, but I'm an LICSW, so I have a practice and I work with young adults, teens and young adults, and it tends to be a big issue among the young people I work with. So I end up doing trainings on this issue because generalized substance abuse trainings didn't really apply to marijuana. It seems to be different. It is different in the way people use it, it's different in the way people think about it, it's different in the way parents think about it in terms of their kids' use. So I really have come up with this because there's a ton of, I don't want to say necessarily misinformation, but conflicting messages out there. And people really, it's hard to know what to believe. So I've tried to, put together this training for you. And my goal is not to tell you what to think or believe about marijuana. I'm going to present you with information just like I do the young people. And you can make your own determination. But there is a lot more information than people think. And then there's still some gaps in information that aren't known. And I'll explain why that is too. All right? Sound good? And I like this to be interactive, so if you have questions, raise your hand. If it's something I'm going to get to, I'll say that, but otherwise, no problem. All right? So, the mixed messages. The beliefs range from it's a dangerous neurotoxin on one side to the other side being it's a harmless recreational substance. And there are people that hold both those views, and not the same person, but there are people that hold both those diverging views. And those are so widely opposing. Any other drug, you wouldn't have that range, right? Most people, if you ask them about cocaine, would fall on the side of it's not good. Even people using it would say it's not good for them, right? But marijuana, we have this miles and miles apart. And then to make it more complicated, we have it's a medicine, right? So if it's a medicine, how can it be bad? So that further murkies, I don't know if murkies the water, muddies the water. All right, so my goal is to give you the truth, and then you can make the determination for yourself. All right, what distinguishes marijuana from other drugs? There are several things. There is an active campaign to promote marijuana use. And you can easily find this by just doing a Google search, put in marijuana. And the first several pages will be positive things about marijuana. How to grow it, why it's good for you, debunking all the lies that people have been telling you about it, meaning all the things that they say are bad aren't true. I'll give you some examples of that. There are also, well, I'll show you now actually. This is, I don't know if you can see the words on this, but this is part of the mixed message because this says, if you smoke marijuana, all these things will happen. Your future, your finance, your education will all go up in smoke. So that's what I would say is an overstatement, right? And then you have other things that say this. Legal, tobacco and alcohol. Tobacco kills 5 million, alcohol kills 2.5. Illegal, marijuana, no known deaths from medical quantities. So that's pretty compelling. I mean, it's kind of an interesting comparison. But it says this, if you are already thinking marijuana is not bad, and when you compare it to these two that are very bad and are illegal, it really makes you wonder, right? This one here also is from a reputable site called Natural Cures Not Medicine. I don't know if you can see the words, but it says alcohol is addictive, depressant, causes cancer, 1 million deaths per year, blah, 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 destroys brain cells. And then cannabis, non-addictive, antidepressant, cures cancer, 0 deaths, saves police millions, no overdoses, grows brain cells, and it's illegal. How many things on this list are true?
None.
Well, interesting. This is what makes it complicated, actually. Several of them have truths in them. Almost all of them. Actually, even this one. The jury's out on that one. They're doing studies in Israel right now that cancer may be beneficial to some form, not cancer, cannabis may be beneficial to some forms of cancer. So that kind of fuels the idea that it could be it could be a medicine, it could be very therapeutic for certain things. But again, not the whole story. This one, antidepressant. Well, in short term, low dose use, it does help with depression. Unfortunately, with long term, chronic use, it does the opposite. And that's kind of the thing. So the people who are promoting it will take part truths and then promote that as the headline and not really tell the whole story. So it can be very complicated. This one, 0 deaths in history. Well, that's not true. I knew a couple personally. But also, it's linked to this one. When people say no one's died from it, they're really talking about overdoses. And the truth is, people don't overdose from marijuana. Well, until it was legal in Colorado and they started making edibles, no one had died that I knew of from an overdose. And that's because the brainstem, part of the brain that controls your automatic functioning, your lungs inflating, your heart rate, there are no cannabinoid receptors in that part of your brain. So no matter how much smoke you do, it won't put that part of the brain to sleep. It looks like, though, the few deaths that have been caused by overdoses were due to edibles, young children eating the edibles thinking it was candy and then having heart arrhythmias, and that was the problem. So the truth is that people don't die from overdoses, but that doesn't say the whole story. All right? This next one looks like a very official site. It's called the Drug Policy Alliance. It sounds like a governmental site, right? It's actually not. It's a pro-legalization site, and you can see that in the fine print. But interestingly, all these questions, will legalized marijuana lead to increased use? Is marijuana a gateway drug? How strong is marijuana today? They will debunk all the things that we say that I'm going to share with you today. So anything that you hear that could be negative, you can go to a site like this that will tell you the opposite. And again, it's usually because they're cherry picking stories or they're only telling you half the story. And the other thing is that sometimes what we've been told about marijuana has been an exaggeration on the other side. So I showed you an example of the up in smoke, kind of saying that you smoke weed, your whole life's going to go up in smoke. Well, that's an over and exaggeration too, for most people. All right, this here, I don't know if you won't be able to read it, but this guy is, what's his name?
Seth Rogen.
Seth Rogen, thank you. Very funny, the young people love him. He plays very, comedic roles. And he is a huge proponent of marijuana. And this is what underneath it says, that basically the studies that showed damage to the brain are old and have been debunked. And it says, none of the medical tests currently used to detect brain damage in humans have been found any harm from marijuana, even from long-term high-dose use. And that's not true. There's several studies that have showed harm. But there is a study that came out recently that said that marijuana grows regions of the brain, and that's true, but they only take a piece of that and then can say something like this, and I'm sure he believes what he's saying, right? It's not, but it's again not the whole truth. And really that's very misleading, especially from someone who has a lot of young fans. The other one is, and he would fit into that category, there's a lot of celebrities who free of charge promote marijuana. And celebrities usually get paid millions of dollars to promote products, but they do this free of charge because they feel very passionate about it. And I'll show you examples of some of them. And it's interesting because they represent every demographic group. So it doesn't matter who you are or who you relate to, you can find a celebrity who is very pro-marijuana. This one everyone knows. He's the granddaddy of weed smoking. He's been promoting it for a long time. Susan Sarandon may surprise people. She's a big promoter of it. Miley Cyrus. This actually could be an anti-marijuana campaign, I think, just in itself. This is Glenn Beck. He's a very far-right pundit, if you don't know of him. And probably out in Northampton, he's probably not allowed on the air. But the next guy you will know, Bill Maher. And they are diametrically opposed in terms of their political views, right? But both of them are pro-marijuana. And it's probably the only thing they agree on. So it reaches across all spectrums. The portrayal in the media, if you can think of a movie, just name some movies that you know have marijuana as their subject. Just say, Up in Smoke, classic, what else? Reefer Madness. Oh no, That's the exception, because that wasn't a commercial movie. That was a movie, a public health movie, to scare people from not smoking, right? But think of commercial movies that have marijuana in the subject. Cheech and Chong, the whole series, right?
Beavis and Butthead.
Beavis and Butthead, right? Harold and Kumar, How High, there's many, right? And what do they all have in common? They're comedies, right? Every one of them are really funny movies. I watched Up in Smoke by Cheech and Chong probably 50 times when I was in college, right? They're very funny. And the message that they send, not so subtly, is that marijuana is a joke. If you contrast that to any other movie that has substance abuse as its subject matter, they're not funny, they're tragedies. They at least show the harm, right? So it's very interesting, and it's not so subtle that we, from very young ages, get messaged that marijuana is a joke. These are some of the examples. This got an Oscar nomination. There's Seth Rogen again. But that got an Oscar nomination. That was
Pineapple Express.
Thank you, my moviegoer, Paul. there's Cheech and Chong. They invented blunts. Long before there were blunts, they were doing blunts. All right. The other thing that makes marijuana different is the social consequences are much less so than with other drugs. So if you look at the social consequences of alcohol are numerous. So that the consequences of the individual using, and then think of it as like ripples in a pond. You drop there's little ripples, so the family gets affected, the neighborhood gets affected, the people that share a road with them, right? With marijuana, the consequences are more isolated to the individual using. So there's less incentive for the society as a whole to want to put a stop to that, because we can say, well, they're just hurting themselves. They're not hurting anyone, right? It's much easier to say that because the social consequences aren't obvious and they don't permeate to the people and the society around them as much. And then the prevailing beliefs about marijuana. These are just some of them. If you ask people, you would find an overwhelming belief that no one ever died from it, cigarettes and alcohol are worse, it's non-addictive, and it's natural, right? And those are what people believe, and there's truth in those. I told you right up front, this is probably true. In fact, if you look at this, I believe this. Marijuana causes less harm than all the other drugs used, including alcohol. That's my belief. That, however, does not mean it's harmless. And that's the point of engagement. So what happens is you usually have a debate where this person says it's harmful, this person says it's harmless, and then there's no common ground, and that's the end of the story. But I say it does cause less harm. I find that agreement. And again, there are some outliers that we'll talk about later, but in general, it causes less harm. But it's not harmless. And what does this mean in your life? What is this harm that is there? And that's where you start. So the consequences, what makes it challenging for someone who does have a problem with marijuana to see it, is that the consequences lag behind the use. So typically, when someone uses a drug and it starts to accumulate consequences in their life, it's pretty obvious at some point that the drug is causing these effects, right? And then eventually they get so weighted that it's not worth it anymore. Well, with marijuana, there are consequences, but they are less obvious, they're more subtle, and they lag behind the use, so it's hard to connect them to the use. So I use this story because a young man that I worked with years ago who was going to be the first kid in his family to graduate high school, so he was very motivated for this. It was a big goal of his. So he had been a chronic smoker, so he decided he was only going to smoke after school, right? Mm-hmm. That was his goal at the time, so that's what he did. He gets his third quarter report, progress report, and it said that he was failing English. So I asked him, why are you failing English? What does it say? He said, because I'm not doing my homework and I'm late, and English happened to be first period. So, nothing to do with marijuana, right? So then we look a little closer. I said, well, what do you do after school? I get high. I said, okay, are you more or less likely to do your homework when you're high? And he was honest, he said less likely. So there's one thing, right? And I said, what about getting up in the morning? Does marijuana affect your getting up? No? Well, the truth is, marijuana does have a hangover effect. A lot of people don't realize, because like so many things about marijuana, it's very subtle. And it's not, if you're drunk and you have a hangover, you know that it's affiliated with alcohol. The thought of alcohol will make you nauseous. You feel sick. The hangover from marijuana is just a heavy head. It's like having had cold medicine the night before. You have no other connections to it, but your head is heavy. And if you're someone who has a hard time getting up in the morning and your head is just a little heavier, it makes it that much easier to stay in bed. So if you look at his life, marijuana was affecting his primary goal, right? But not obviously so. You had to connect the dots for him. And if someone doesn't want to see it, it makes it that much easier not to. The other thing is that the consequences, again, that are there, they're more subtle. So it's not like you're drunk and you drive into a tree, cause, effect, it's obvious, right? With marijuana, they're very subtle. And this is the, this one, I'll show you. This is the example I like to use for this is heroin or cocaine use. So it's very obvious. It's a hurricane. You can't ignore that this is happening in your life. Marijuana is like fog, right? It's very subtle. You don't have a great incentive to get out of the fog. You know you need to get out of this. This is impacting your life, but it's hard to tell how. I can still do most of the things that I'm expected to do. In fact, you might not know that you've missed something in the fog. And it's actually harder to get out of the fog. And this is analogous to weed because weed gets in every aspect of people's lives. But they don't have the natural or the obvious incentive to change that. This other graph simply shows, and this is really to illustrate a point, is that this C is cocaine, this A is alcohol, and this M is marijuana. This represents years of use on the bottom, and this is severity of consequences on this axis. So in a relatively short amount of time, you'll experience some severe consequences from cocaine abuse. In alcohol, it can take you a lot longer, but you can get to that same level of severe consequences. With marijuana, I would argue that you will never, again, there are some outliers, in general, you will not get to this level of consequences. You'll be here, but this still can be very substantial. Not finishing high school, not getting an adequate job. There are still some significant consequences, interfering with your relationships, things that matter. They might not be dramatic, they might not be the things that end up in the hospital or get you in the newspaper, but still can be significant in someone's life. All right? The idea, and this is something that I will hope that you take away, if nothing else. Hopefully you'll take away more, but if you only take away one thing, this is it. Marijuana is significant for what you don't do. Other drugs are significant for what you do when you're on them, and it's very easy to find the evidence. Marijuana is more significant for what you don't do as a result. So it's like the passive effect is what it is, and it's much harder to demonstrate that in someone's life. It's like proving a negative. It's much harder to see it, right? I'm not doing anything. I had a mother approached me recently, and she said that she was trying to get her son. He was really shutting down and not doing a lot of anything. He didn't get his application into college on time. He wasn't working. He was staying in his room most of the time. And she was obviously very upset. And he said, I'm not doing anything. Like as that is his defense. But that's exactly what her issue was, that he wasn't doing anything. But he wasn't hurting anyone, he meant. You know, I'm not doing anything wrong. He wasn't moving forward, unfortunately. And there's an expression, one of my kids told me this. It said that if you're on the train tracks, it's not enough to be on the track. You have to keep moving in order not to get hit by the train. Does that make sense? Right? So sometimes, but with marijuana, I mean, oftentimes you aren't moving forward, but if everyone else is moving forward, you have the effect of moving back. Right? The other part is it's considered natural. Again, I don't debate this. It is natural. I mean, it grows from a seed. It's been around for thousands of years. That in itself doesn't make it justifiable thing that you should ingest, though, because tobacco is natural, opium is natural, arsenic's natural. So there's a lot of things that are natural. That doesn't mean that we want to ingest them. And this separates it dramatically. So the parental view of marijuana is dramatically different than it is for all other drugs. Right? There's no parent that has ever spoken to me that justifies their kid doing cocaine or even drinking alcohol excessively. So if I had a parent approach me that their kid is drinking every day or almost every day, they would be incredibly alarmed. No parent would say, I think that's okay. But if I have that same parent that has their child smoking marijuana every day or almost every day, it's not obviously a problem. So it's interesting, right? And this was left on my machine recently. A woman called. She wanted me to work with her son. And she said, you know, he's always been a really good student, but now he's losing interest in the school, and he's falling behind, and we're afraid he's not going to go to college. And this is the last thing she said. He smokes more marijuana than we're comfortable with. And that makes it different, right? Because what is she saying?
We let it go.
Yes, there's a level at which they are comfortable. And unfortunately, he's a teen, and he crossed that line, right? But this makes it very different. And again, makes it... People think it's non-addictive. Well, the truth is marijuana is addictive. It's not a point I like to debate because it's not the relevant point either. Because it's always known to be psychologically dependent, that we can develop a psychological dependence on it. So that's always been that physical addiction has often thought to be non-existent, but it is true that it is physically addicting. And the way that we find out is, I've known this clinically because I have clients who can't stop. Mm-hmm. And they incur consequences and they still continue to do it. But they did studies with rats, and rats will self-inject. And that's a threshold of addiction, because for a rat to inflict pain on themselves, they're a lot smarter than we are. They won't do that unless they're addicted, right? So we know that, but it shows up in lots of different ways. But it's less so addicting than alcohol. So it's almost half as addicting as alcohol is, right? So it's less addicting, but it still is addicting. And one of the ways it shows up to every year, in late summer, there are several, someone reminded me of this today in earlier training, there are several football players in the National Football League that get suspended for the first couple games for testing positive for marijuana. Now, you could say they just really like it, or there's something else going on, because if you know the lifespan of a national football and NFL player is a very short amount of time, and each game is worth $100,000 for some players, right? So they're giving up a lot because they like it. So you might think that it's more than that.
When you say 9-15, can you just explain that statistic?
Oh, yes.
9%?
Oh, so, yes. So 9% of all the people who smoke marijuana will become addicted. However, that's for adults. For people who start as teens, it goes up.
Mm-hmm.
But 15% of all the people who use alcohol become addicted. 25% of all the people who use heroin become addicted. People are usually surprised by that one.
Mm-hmm.
People think it's going to be higher. But there's a lot of people who try it and never do it again, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even a drug as strong as heroin, people don't become addicted instantly. Some people may, but most people don't. Most people, you have to use something for a while before it hooks you. The thing is, you don't know when it's going to hook you.
Mm-hmm.
So I had an addict describe it to me like this. It's a little off topic, but I think it makes a good analogy. She said it's like having a tiger cub as a pet. So it's very exotic, it's exciting, a little dangerous, right? But you know, you're done, you put it in the cage, and you go back to your life. And then you take it out and play, and then when you're done, you put it back in the cage. And there are people who do this, that use drugs like heroin and crack, you know, and presumably go on with their life. One day, what happens to the tiger? It doesn't go back in the cage. It's bigger. It's been growing all along, but it's very slowly, and then it doesn't go back in the cage, and that's the addiction. And you get mauled. Typically, that's what happened to what's his name? Not Siskel and Ebert. You know the ones. All right, and again, back to this. It's less harm doesn't mean harmless. All right. So these are some of the reasons that people give for liking it. For young people in particular, it could, and I will tell you, a lot of what I'm going to say you could extrapolate to adults, but I'm not here to do that. I'm not here to tell adults what they should do. I just know that for teens, the jury is in. We know it's not good because of the developing brain, and I'm going to talk about the brain a little bit. For adults, people can debate that and make a case one way or another, but for teens, it's known, and there's plenty of ample evidence that it's damaging for the adolescent brain. So these are the reasons that young people give for liking marijuana. It relaxes me, it helps me chill, it's fun, helps me when I'm angry, I do better in school, helps me focus, makes me more creative, stops me from being bored, all my friends do it, some will say it helps me sleep. All right, so there's several reasons, and this is the thing that I will tell you, as adults, it does all those things. You know, sometimes people are surprised to hear me say that, but the truth is it does all those things. But the kicker is, at least in the short term, and there are diminishing effects. So over time, the positive effects dissipate, and negative effects tend to creep in, and sometimes we'll replace them with the exact opposite effect that they're trying to achieve. So people who use for anxiety, maybe works at the beginning, but over time, it can worsen anxiety. Same with depression, all right? And I would argue strongly that there are better ways to achieve all those things. And the things, this is the thing, whatever they're doing on that list from before, they're not learning to do on their own. So they're not developing emotionally. Because that whole list of vital things that you need to learn to do, these are all things we need to learn to do to be mature adults. And if I'm using marijuana to do those things, I'm not learning to do them on my own. Yes?
For somebody who's a regular long-term user, I know you're saying that the anxiety levels can build over time. Is it still anxiety reducing when
in the moment? That's interesting. It depends. And this is why in some of the things I'm going to say, I'm going to answer that depends to your questions, unfortunately. But it really depends on the individual. I had a young man who's been smoking for years. We started working together through a lot of motivational interviewing technique. He's decided to stop. And actually because his mother's a chronic smoker and he doesn't like the effect on her. And he keeps talking about her being immature. And so he doesn't want to end up like her. Well, he said to me, he stopped, and that he stopped for 2 weeks, and then he went back, and he said it made him incredibly anxious. What's that?
To not smoke?
No, when he went back to smoking, he got really paranoid, which is something he hadn't dealt with in a long time. So it really depends on the person. But it's not a good treatment for anxiety in general. Yes?
Are these copies of the slides going to be available?
We can do that.
Great.
Yeah, if you sign up at the very front table there. If you put your email address, I'll share all this.
And a check for $250.
Yeah.
No,
When you talk about the long term, is it appropriate when teaching this to talk about overuse, or should I be talking about long-term use?
That's both, actually. So the people that have the worst outcomes are the chronic users, people who use regular heavy use, right?
Mhm.
But there was a study that just was reported in the Boston Globe 2 weeks ago that said that even casual use for young people changes the brain. Now, they didn't say what it changed it to. It didn't say it was automatically bad, but it changed the brain, the structure of the brain. So
Yeah.
what does it change to? That we're not sure at this point, but it made changes even in casual use. We know that long-term heavy use has detrimental effects.
Right.
But for a developing brain and the malleability of the brain, it doesn't take a lot to make changes to it. All right, so I'm coming up on that, I believe. I think that's next. So again, it's like taking NyQuil to sleep. It may help you do those things, but it's giving you more of other things that you maybe don't want to, right? And what it's doing for you, you're not learning on your own. This is the definition of emotional immaturity. And this is why if you look at people, and not everyone, but several people that I know that have smoked throughout their adolescence and now are young adults or older adults, they still can present as emotionally mature. It doesn't mean when you engage with them, they seem like adults, but when they're under duress, they act like someone who's younger than they are. Right? So this is the thing that makes it very complicated, or it's not that complicated, but it makes it very precarious, is that at age 13, the reward center of the brain is fully developed. So they, well, I'll finish this part. It takes 24 for the regulatory region and the frontal cortex to be developed. So that is like having a teen, and this is why we don't allow teens to live on their own. They live with adults, supervised adults, hopefully, is that they have a car, for example, that has a very sensitive accelerator and a very weak brake, right? And that's a bad combination, and you can see that with young people, right? When you introduce drugs into this equation at an early age, that has major effects on the reward center. So the pre-adult brain, I don't even call it teen brain anymore because it's really pre-adult. It's whatever age you are until you're an adult, you're a pre-adult, right? So that can be 24, 25, it can be older depending on who the individual is. But you have increased plasticity in key regions of the brain. So it's most responsive to stimulation and most vulnerable to harm at the same time. So if you think about plasticity as malleability, the brain is more subject to change, which is really good because they can learn and grow in ways that they couldn't previously, but it's also subject to more harm at that time. So doing things to the brain during this period of plasticity makes a bigger indent, makes a bigger impression than it would otherwise. The good news, and I think it comes up somewhere, is that it's also better to stop during the period of malleability because you have more preparative quality during that time too. So someone who starts early, it's never too late to stop, but the earlier the better.
Oh yeah, never too early to stop.
It's never too early, yes, or late, but earlier is better. Exactly. All right, so for all of us, throughout our lives, there's a battle going on between the limbic system, the emotional center, and the prefrontal cortex, the reason center. And that's always going on, right? So you can think in your own life. Well, with teens, that connection is really tenuous. So when they're upset or under duress, which wins? Which wins the battle? The emotional center, right? And you can see it actually. If you have a teen who was not supervised by an adult and they get up in the morning and they didn't go to bed on time, they were on social media and they're really tired in the morning and they wake up for school and they're so tired and the bed feels so good and they stay in bed, right? And they would if they had the option. In fact, a lot of the kids I work with do just that. And I say to them, look around this office or this school, wherever I am, I say, see how many adults here do you think would have liked to stay in bed this morning? And they usually say all of them, and I say you're right, especially if it's rainy or cold. But somehow they managed to get up. And why did they get up? They all wanted to stay in bed, but they got up because their frontal cortex kicked in and said, I need to go to work, I don't want to get in trouble, I want to get whatever those reasons are, right? And for them, if they had time or an adult around to remind them of those things, that would happen. But the limbic system has a lot more influence, especially when they're fatigued or under stress. All right? Let's see, more malleable. The analogy or the visual that I like is Play-Doh, because everyone's seen Play-Doh, played with Play-Doh. And so if you take Play-Doh and you roll it into a ball, an oval like a brain, and you let it sit out for an hour, It will get a little firm, but it'll still be soft to the exterior, right? That's what an adolescent brain is like. If you leave it out overnight, that is an adult brain. It's firm, but it's still possible to make changes. It just takes much more to make those changes, right? And so this is the thing. At age 16, adolescents can perform as good or better than adults in certain tasks. When you introduce reward, they actually outperform adults. This is interesting, right? But when they're stressed or fatigued, their performance goes way down. Whereas we, because our connection is stronger, even when we wake up in the morning and don't feel good, we still can make good decisions because our connection between the two centers is much firmer. It's like if you think of it like a cable, right? And theirs is like loose wiring. It's going all over the place and eventually gets to, hopefully, the prefrontal cortex, right? Drugs in the brain. Drugs for young people is especially enjoyable to them. It actually feels better to them than it does to you as an adult. And that's because, well, a lot of reasons, but one is because they now have more dopamine receptors than they previously had. So relative to how they used to feel, when they do something that brings pleasure, it brings more pleasure than they've had. The other side is true too. When they have pain, they feel that pain more deeply too. And you can think of this. How many of you have teens at home? How many of you think of them, they can be overly dramatic at times? Right? Well, they're not really acting. That's how they really feel this. But we look at it and say, why are they acting like that? Like, that isn't how I would act. And by the way, I will share one other thing in general about teens, is adults have amnesia about what it was like to be a teen. Once you become an adult, you forget all this stuff that you knew very well when you were a teen. It's important to try to step back. The other thing I'm going to tell you, this is really good news for those of you who have teens, it's a temporary stage. This is something adults need to be reminded, because you think, I had this sweet little kid that lived in my house and liked me, and I have this older person that looks a little similar, but they're really different, right? And they can be, but just remember, that's a temporary stage. Adolescence is not a permanent stage. They will not always be this person who they are. And a lot of adults have much better relationships with their parents than they did when they were teens. So I just will put that out there. All right, remember that. Hold on to that a couple more years. Let's see. Connection to developmental tasks. So what is supposed to be happening? I want to mention this first too. There are cannabinoid receptors all over the brain and all over the body in lots of regions. And there's a whole cluster of them right at the gateway to the frontal lobe. And that is not a good thing, because what happens when you smoke weed, you're actually interfering with the development even further. So it's like, if you think of like centurions, you're blocking the way to the frontal lobe by smoking marijuana as a young person. Now, as an adult, if you've already developed the frontal cortex, it's going to have a much different effect, right? It's already developed. But they're in the process of developing these connections. And by smoking marijuana, they're actually cutting them off. They're stopping them from developing, right? So again, it doesn't mean when you're not smoking, you're not going to start developing them. But it's like you keep interfering with it. And we really want them to be developing connections most effectively during this stage, because what's happening to the adolescent is they're forming their adult brain. That's one of the major goals, is that the brain is learning what it needs to know to be a successful adult. So what you do to it and what you don't do to it is informing the brain of the adult person that they're going to be. Now again, I will always say that you can play catch up and you can learn, but there are things that you can do that can make it really hard if you do it during this stage of malleability. So the thing is, exposure to drugs prematurity, so pre-adulthood, can make permanent changes to the reward system. So we see some people who, when they're older, they feel they need this substance or a substance to experience normal pleasure. And that's concerning. And again, I don't mean to scare you. There's a difference between someone who's using casually and someone who's using chronically. None is the best, more and regular is the worst, right? And there's a spectrum. And again, there's something else being important, is the things that we struggle with, the things that our vulnerabilities that we already have, the areas that are difficult for me as a person, are the things that are going to be most affected. So if I already struggle with emotional regulation, that's the thing that's going to show up. If I'm already depressed, that's going to show up. If I already have learning issues. So whatever that area of weakness or vulnerability, that's the thing that's going to be most affected. So again, and I say that because not everything I say will apply to every person, right? There'll be differential impact on different people. So let me see. So these are some of I mentioned the prefrontal cortex a bunch of times, and sometimes you hear the functions as referred to as executive functioning skills. These are the functions of that front of the brain that is last to develop and is the part that's most impacted by chronic or heavy marijuana smoke because it's the part that's developing during this. So these are things that it does: organized response to complex problems, plans steps to meet objectives, searches memory for relevant experience, adapts strategies to accommodate new data, guides behavior and verbal skills, and houses working memory, manages emotional impulses and self-regulation. This is one we see a lot. Right? This is something that they are not as good at as they will be when they're adults. But this is also something they're interfering with by smoking a lot of weed, which seems counterintuitive because a lot of times they're smoking to chill, right? To not overreact. But they're not learning to do it. They're not developing that capacity. So when people use a substance to achieve a goal, they may get that goal. And oftentimes they do. That's why they're using the substance, right? If it didn't work, they probably would stop doing it. So I say I'm someone who gets all worked out and I need to chill, so I smoke a blunt and then I'm chill. Or I'm someone who learned to talk about it or to take a walk or to meditate or to deep breathe or whatever out of the number of ways to self-modulate my affect. They both look the same, but there's a huge difference. Person number 1 has increased their need for that substance. Person number 2 has increased their capacity for that feeling. Right? Because they own it, it's internal. Does that make sense? And that's the key difference. So it's really one of the definitions of dependence. The last one is form socially beneficial behaviors, including empathy, altruism, interpretation of facial expressions. So those are other things that can lag behind by not developing that part of the brain. All right. I won't spend too much time on this, but the pharmacology of cannabis. So there's 460 known chemicals in marijuana, and we typically talk about 1, THC, right? And there are 60 cannabinoids, which THC is one of. Another one that you may have heard mentioned recently is cannabidiol, CBD. That's the one that Sanjay Gupta, am I saying it right? Gupta, thank you. I'm tired, I keep telling I'm tired. He did a special on CNN, right? A couple specials now. And they're largely very pro-marijuana because he shows the medical efficacy of CBD, in particular on young children who are suffering from really severe seizure disorders. And he ultimately comes out in favor of this, but again, the ones I saw, he never mentioned it, but not for adolescents, not for pre-adults. It's like, this is good. Even, I just read Dr. Andrew Weil, do you know him? Friend of Oprah, really holistic health medicine guy. I'm friends with him on Facebook, well, not like close friends, but but he sent out a letter because he wanted to get to the bottom of this. People were asking him about what are your feelings on medical marijuana. So he did this whole letter, very talking about the pros, cons, and he largely was in favor. Then he had one line about, but experts say not for teens, not for young adults, not for teens. I mean, it was clear about that. Even though it was largely positive, that one line was, but not for. And I would say that any of the benefits they could achieve would be outweighed by the harm that it would cause the pre-adult brain. Now that could be argued if you're someone who's having multiple seizures a day and you're not developing anyways, But, all right, the other thing that's very different from adults who often look at young people and say, you know what, I did it when I was a kid and I'm fine. And I would say to you, we don't know that. No, exactly. No, I wouldn't say that. I would say maybe you are, but I would say that there's some big differences. So the weed or the marijuana, when you were young, when I was young certainly, and when many of us were young, it was very different than it is today. It was contained 1% THC, and now it's average 13, but can go all the way up to 30. So that's a different drug. And the higher the potency of THC, the more greater propensity for addiction. So,
Rick, a way I heard that explained recently was really helpful was the potency of marijuana now would be, if you're having a glass of wine in the 70s, which is like 8 ounces of red wine, the potency of that alcohol, think of that. And then you're having the exact same glass, but instead of red wine, it's 8 ounces of whiskey.
Yeah, perfect.
So that's the shift that's happened, but everyone talks about it as if it's the same drug.
Perfect. No, that's very important. And a lot of the studies that were done back in the day too. So it is a different drug, and it has different impacts. And one of the other things that, when you hear these positive benefits, they're talking about weed in its pure form, the balance, and now we're increasing the THC purposely to get the psychotropic effect up. but we're also decreasing the other therapeutic things like CBD at the same time. When you increase THC, you decrease the other ones. So some of the things that we didn't see before, we may start seeing in the future. Some of the negative effects that weren't showing up may start to show up. So let's see. So just in general, I just want to say that for adults, I think it's very common for us to say, you know, like, I did this as a kid and, you know, it worked out for me and I'm not going to, but it really is important that we see it as different and we know things now that we didn't know then. You know, I had a guy speak to me today in an earlier training and he said, geez, I wish I knew this when I was raising my sons because I didn't know about the brain stuff. And you know, I said, well, that you're a bad father. No, I said to him, I said, no, of course, you had no way of knowing. We didn't know a lot about the brain. You know, we could see functionally what it was doing, but we didn't know. You know, now they do functional MRIs and we can actually see parts of the brain that are working or not working. And that people have greater masses in certain parts that smoke or not smoke. So we know a lot more than we used to know. But I mean, I can't believe anyone thought it would be a free lunch. That's one thing that surprises me. Like if you do something a lot, even orange juice, if you drink too much, isn't good. If you know almonds are one of the best, almonds are like the superfood, right? How many people like almonds, right? Do you know, for some of them, like me, I'm one of these people, if I eat too many almonds, I get canker sores. Do you know that's connected? One of the best foods. So, my point in saying that is there are consequences to everything, right? So we don't want to be naive to think that if I do something a lot, then you know there are consequences, and we should at least know what they are before we make that. One of the analogies I use with kids is water. You can die from drinking too much water, right? So 3 things that we've all been told about marijuana that have been, well, this is the public health message from the past that I think has been largely unsuccessful because we have not seen the rates going in the right direction. In fact, what we've seen is marijuana rates have fluctuated. They've gone up, and they were worse in like the late 60s, early 70s, and they went down for a while in the 80s, 90s, and now they went up in the 2000s, but now they're level. So overall, high school kids, I think it's 41%, report 30-day use in the last 30 days. But the group that we're most concerned with are the people who are heavy users, the chronic users. That represents 8% of all people from 12 to 18 are people who smoke 20 or more times during a month. Yeah, that's concerning. Those are the heavy users, and that's the group that's growing, because why not? If I like weed and it doesn't cause any harm, why not do it more? It doesn't make, why wouldn't it? There's no harm. But that's why we have to inform young people and ourselves that there are some significant harms that we should be made aware of. I tell young people this, if it were up to me, yeah, you wouldn't do it at all. My second choice would be that you wait until you're 24. Third choice would be you wait till you're 21, because you develop, you know, incrementally. And then I would say, the next choice would be that if you already are smoking, that you would cut down dramatically. Because if you give yourself breaks, then you are able to, you know, catch up a little. But if you're constantly assaulting the brain, it never catches up, right? So you have to give it a chance, give it a breather, take breaks. And it would also, if you do legitimately take breaks, you'll have to find other ways of coping during that time. If you're going to successfully do it. So 3 things that we've all been told is that 1, it's a gateway drug. Is that true? Is marijuana a gateway drug? Yes, sometimes, not always, right? So the reason that was said that it was a gateway drug was basically telling young people if you smoke weed, you're going to do crack, right? But the truth is most people who smoke marijuana won't go on to other drugs. But all the people who do started with marijuana. So it's a gateway drug for the people who go on. But it doesn't mean you absolutely will go on. However, if you start as a teen, you have 2 to 3 times more likelihood of going on to another drug. So earlier, this again is the vulnerability of starting early, because you've groomed your brain to get its needs met externally, right? So when marijuana is not working like you want it to, you're going to look to something else.
And I always felt like it was, I would explain it to the kids as a gateway that it's, you know, you're giving yourself permission to do something highly illegal, more than maybe just sneaking a beer, and you've then found joy in that, and it's kind of opened you up to, well, if I'm getting away with this, I can get away with that, and it kind of opens the floodgate of, gee, look what I can get away with, let's keep trying. Yeah,
and you can take away the illegal part, and that'll still be there, because it's, you know, they're going to get a reward. It will feel good to them, for most people. That kills brain cells. We've said that for years, right? Does it kill brain cells? The recent study came out saying that it actually grows brain cells. and your young people will know this study. It came from the University of Texas. It's pretty compelling. It's a legitimate school. It's not like the University of Phoenix online. But the truth is, if you read the whole study, it basically said that the areas of the brain had increased activity in that didn't previously. So I read the study many times, and the way that I explain it in my non-scientific jargon is this. It's like if you have a stream going through your yard, and you take a boulder, that was my Boston accent, sorry, boulder. If I can hear it, it's really bad. Boulder. If you take your big rock and you drop it in the stream, what happens to the water?
It's going to create new passes.
Right? Yeah. It's you could say it stopped the water, right?
Yeah.
But the water will find another way around. So some people would say, oh, it created new pathways. New streams were created by the boulder. But not really. It's that you stopped one and it found other ways around. And the brain is like that. The brain will look for ways to get there. It'll always look for ways to make those connections. So it didn't really form new connections. It interrupted a connection, and the brain found an alternative route. Right? So it's kind of different. And the way it was reported was like weed actually helps the brain. Yes?
You prompted me, after this, could you go back a few slides, the one that was about stimulating activity?
Mhm.
I saw that up there, and I don't think that you talked, does that relate it at all? Or?
Which one was this in?
Yeah, I should have brought it up right at the time, it was a little while ago.
Okay.
The,
Prefrontal cortex.
We'll find it. Well, it might come up again anyways, and if not, I'll find it. So again, there's conflicting studies, and depending on what side you want to be on, you can find something to support your belief, right? Yes.
Was this study just with teenagers?
No, actually, it was not with teenagers, and that's the other part. That when you report these studies, they're not saying that this is different for teens, and I'm going to show you the study in a little bit, at least a piece of it. The sperm count, I don't know if you've heard this, they still say this, bless you, that a lower sperm count. The truth is it has a decreasing effect on testosterone, and that's why it's an outgrowth. But it does affect testosterone negatively, but teens have an ample amount, more than they need, so they're not going to notice a difference at this point in their life. So it really wasn't a deterrent message that it was sent. But the fact that it lowers testosterone may be important to them later on in life. And actually, this is from High Times magazine. This is a magazine specifically to promote marijuana use, growth, and recreation. And they said, in addition to potentially causing erectile dysfunction, smoking weed has such a relaxing effect. Being high can actually cause men to lose their interest in sex as well as suffer from delayed ejaculation and sometimes pain. And that's from High Times magazine, right? So, interesting. The physiological effects that we should talk about. I'm going to revisit something after, but this is something that's worth noting. I mean, the rate is very small, but for people, young men, this is one of the only cancers that affects young people more than older people, and it's testicular cancer. And you have an increased risk for testicular cancer up to 2 times if you're a weekly user or started as a teen. The good news is there's a low incidence of it, and the better news is that because it's an external organ, it can be detected easily and treated if caught early. You know, unlike something like ovarian cancer that you only find out when it's major, you know, when it's already causing disruption. And in fact, in other countries that aren't as squeamish around sexual issues and body issues, they actually encourage young men to do self-exams on a regular basis. And the Australian national rugby team actually did a PSA where they actually demonstrated doing. Did anyone see this? They had towels on, but they described what they were doing. And it really, I mean, these are guys that everyone looked up to, and I think for young people, it's like, wow, if they're doing that. And not that we have to encourage young people to touch themselves, but I think what it was is that it was really focused on this, and it made a difference, you know? But that would never fly in this country, you know? Tolerance is something that gets discussed in a really abstract way, that people will recognize that marijuana increases that people get a tolerance to marijuana, but they don't think of it as any big deal. But tolerance really means this, right? Your brain plus the weed equals the high. Well, if you add the same weed and the high goes down, what is the variable? The brain had to change. So when you have tolerance, that means you've actually made changes to your brain. Because the same drug is having a differing effect on you. Right? So that sounds different than tolerance. Tolerance, we're like, yeah, tolerance, whatever. But actually you've made structural changes to your brain. That's a little different. The increased risk of cancer due to smoke, what do you think? Mentioned earlier, right? That's not been demonstrated. Even lung cancer hasn't been associated with marijuana smoking. Now, the reason they think that is because there's some counter effect of some of the chemicals in marijuana that actually end up being therapeutic at the same time that the smoke would obviously be bad. Because smoke, we're the only beings on the planet, I could even say organism on the planet, that will voluntarily ingest smoke. Every other being will flee because smoke is oxygen depriving, and maybe there is fire there too. And they flee. We're the only ones that will voluntarily put it in us. Isn't that interesting? We're supposed to be the higher beings, right? Well, but it does turn out for whatever reason. But so people tout this as a benefit. It doesn't cause lung cancer, but it does cause emphysema, chronic COPD, thank you, COPD, and bronchitis. So those are not minor things. If you've known anyone that suffered from emphysema, it's like suffocating slowly, right? So again, not the whole story. Low birth weight babies and stillbirths 2 to almost 3 times, your rate goes up. Man boobs or gynecomastia, again, rare. These are rarer things. This, not so much. The baby necking is hangover associated with marijuana, so having that heavy head in the morning. And suppress immune functioning. So people who smoke marijuana get sick more often. And this is documented, you can see it. But one of the reasons that I found interesting support in a strange place was that they actually were giving marijuana to people after kidney transplants. And the reason they did that is because they want to suppress your immune system so that the body doesn't reject it. So it's recognized as immune suppressant. Cognitive impact. This gets complicated, okay? It is slow but real for chronic users. Again, it doesn't show up instantly. It's something that's gradual over time, so it's very hard to notice it. But I will tell you this Connor's dad story, because this always sticks with me. I had this young man, Chris, who was a huge proponent of marijuana smoking. He just could see nothing wrong with it. He just wanted to smoke. Again, he came from a family that had much more serious substance abuse, so he felt like by comparison he was doing much better, and he was in a lot of ways. But he saw nothing wrong with it, and he said he used to always bring up Connor's dad. This was his best friend, Connor. And Connor's dad was the coolest dad because Connor's dad smoked weed, and Connor's dad let them smoke in the house, and Connor's dad had a great car and a great girlfriend and a great job, all this stuff. So every time anything came up negative about marijuana, he would use Connor's dad as the role model, like, that's who I'm going to be. So I tried to be diplomatic and non-confrontational. I would say, well, there are exceptions to every rule, right? I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but he might be the exception, and we can't plan on being that exception. But then one day he brought up, one too many times I said to him, Chris, is there any negative that you have seen associated with his marijuana use? Anything? And he kind of chuckles. He goes, well, he does lose his car sometimes. This is a true story. So I said, you mean his car keys? He goes, no, his car. And he's laughing, and I'm laughing. And this is very funny. The guy's in his late 40s. Now, I said, that's very interesting. I said, because, it's a very large, expensive object, and most of us remember when we put it, right? But he said, I said, so what's up with that? He said, his memory's fried from smoking so long. Like, this is like a disposable item. And we see this, right? With a lot of people who smoke a long time, you'll see cognitive deficits that show up. You don't need testing for it. You can just tell there's a delayed reaction time or processing time. In this case, he's losing his car. He just would space out where he put it, right? So we're laughing, and then I'm thinking, oh, good, finally I have something. I said, so what's up with that, Chris? Why is he losing his car? He goes, his memory's fried from all the weed smoking. I said, okay, where is your memory? He goes, your memory in your head. I said, where specifically is your memory? He goes, your brain. I said, so you need to tell me, he smoked so much weed that he's damaged his brain to the point where he can't find something that no one else loses? And of course, he's not laughing at this point, right? But that's a pretty dramatic story, right? That doesn't happen to everyone. But it's not scot-free. Like, there's some consequence in there if you look hard enough, and you don't have to look that deep sometimes. This gets complicated where you have a lot of young people saying it actually helps them in school. How many people have heard that from young people that it actually helps them focus? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I doubt that we're going to prescribe it for ADHD, but because we already do have things that work, right? But the other thing is, I think it's kind of a misconception a little, because marijuana is largely a drug of perception. So when you eat Doritos when you're high, and they are the best food you ever ate, that's no different than the Doritos that you ate when you weren't high, right? It's your perception change. So when someone is studying or learning on weed, and they're in class and they're saying, I never cared about history, but this is fascinating, and you're like glued to everything that's being said. I use the analogy like this. Remember those old vacuum cleaners, the Electroluxes, that had the green bag in them? Remember? That green bag has that heavy paper, right? But which you can't tell from the naked eye, but it's actually lightly perforated. And it has to be perforated because otherwise the bag would explode. So it's supposed to let the air through and catch all the debris, right? Learning on weed is like vacuuming without the bag. So imagine I take the bag out, now I'm vacuuming. What's happening? It is sucking like it's never sucked before, right? And what's happening to the debris? Going out the back, right? So learning on weed is really the illusion of learning. From the front end, it looks like I'm bringing it in like, wow, this is fascinating, but I'm not retaining it. Does that make sense? And so, but I have to be honest though, if someone wasn't in the seat to begin with, they're gonna learn more than they would have if they weren't there, right? But it's not the best way to learn. You're better off being able to learn to manage to be there and learn sober. Let's see. Oh, this interesting study that was done years ago. I can't find the reference for it now. I read it years ago, but I use it as an example of something that really highlights something that most people will know about marijuana, is that they took two groups of college students of equal intelligence and aptitude, and they separated them. And they got one group got high, and the other group not high. And they gave them a series of tests and puzzles, and they had them complete this whole battery of tests. And at the end, they asked them to evaluate how they think they did on the test. Who do you think did better? The high group or the non-high group? The non-high group did better, not significantly, but better. And who gave themselves better grades? The high group gave them way better grades than they actually did, right? And that non-high group was pretty on par as they were. So again, it's a drug of perception. It's not really changing your performance, but it's changing your evaluation of your performance. Okay? This is very important when it comes to marijuana and the effect on young people's brains. This is from Yale, pretty reputable school, right? This is pretty recent. They did functional MRIs, and they found this, and this was reported widely, is that deficits may remit in adults after sustained abstinence. All right? More severe deficits, well, I'll stop that for now. Read this first sentence. Deficits may remit in adults after sustained abstinence. How is that reported? Right here. Marijuana does not cause long-term cognitive impairment in users. That's true. But it doesn't say the whole story. See the difference between those two? This is from the Policy Alliance, the legalization group, and this is from Yale. And they are true, but the meaning comes across very different. But they do share something in the next part. More severe deficits without remittance with early onset. What does that mean? For pre-adults, it's worse and it won't go better when they just stop. That's what that's saying. Now, to their credit, they did add this, who start after 21 years old. So even the Drug Policy Alliance said that it's different for people. So when you asked that question, right? All right, so this is what young people are dealing with online. This is what gets reported. This is the truth. And this is not true, it's just a different slant on it. Now this is where it gets really murky. So this is the boulder in the stream story that I was telling you about. This is from University of Texas. So this is what they said. It's about gray matter in the brain, and the frontal cortex may be more vulnerable than white matter to the effects of THC. The study provides evidence, blah, 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 blah. But then, the effects of chronic marijuana use on the brain may depend on the age of first use and the duration of use. So again, these questions remain, but it's clear that starting early and using a lot is worse.
I was just curious because you were saying the study, how the brain would find pathways around the obstruction, just if it found to be in a developing brain, it would be easier, in my mind, it would be easier for the brain to develop different pathways than an older brain.
It could, but unfortunately they're looking for more direct, right? Remember I said, so the brain that you're developing gel is supposed to be more efficient.
Right.
Which means not going around about looking for the most direct pathways.
Right.
So you're right. So it doesn't mean they won't get there, but it just may be circuitous and they may miss out on something else.
Yeah.
So this just talks about gray and white matter. I won't get into that because it's pretty hard to understand. You can read it if you want, but for me, it's still murky a little. But basically, the gray matter is the matter that has to do with the neurons, and the white matter is the connectivity medium. And for people who smoke long term, they tend to have less white matter in their brain. And it means that so basically, the medium that the synapses are happening between, if there's less medium, it just takes longer to get there. Right? So it's less efficient. This is something I want to show you. Let's see. This is just a brief video on what's happening in the brain when you smoke marijuana.
For centuries, humans have been using substances to alter their state of mind, from caffeine, cigarettes, and alcohol to more extreme drugs. But as the most commonly used illicit drug in North America, where does marijuana fit in, and how exactly does it affect your brain? First, we need to understand how the brain functions. Your neurons are the cells that process information in the brain. By releasing chemicals called neurotransmitters from the axon of one neuron to the dendrite of another, they change the electrical charge of the receiving neuron, consequently exciting or inhibiting it. If excited, the signal is passed on. Though it sounds simple, these signals work together and the effect is quickly compounded into complex configurations within milliseconds, flushing over the entire brain. This is what happens every single time you think, breathe, or move. So what's going on inside your brain when you're smoking marijuana? Well, unlike alcohol, which contains molecules nothing like those in our body, cannabis contains molecules that resemble those produced in our very own brains, cannabinoids. Though naturally these cannabinoids circulate in much lower quantities compared to the large influx imposed by smoking. Specifically, the chemical tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, resembles a natural transmitter called anandamide. These cannabinoids are specialized neurotransmitters released by neurons having just fired. Neurons temporarily become unresponsive after firing to prevent them from overreacting or being too dominant. This allows your brain to function in a calm and controlled manner. But cannabinoids interrupt this approach in some parts of the brain. Instead, they remove the refractory period of neurons that are already active and cause your thoughts, imagination, and perception to utterly magnify itself. This means once you begin your train of thought, it becomes the most significant and profound thing ever. You can't see the big picture or even recall your last epiphany because you're caught up in the momentum of a particular idea, and your neurons keep firing until a new idea takes hold and you go off on a new tangent. These cannabinoids also affect the levels of dopamine and norepinephrine in your brain, often leading to a sense of euphoria, relaxation, pain modulation, and general enhancement of an experience, though sometimes causing anxiety. Furthermore, there are cannabinoid receptors in areas controlling short-term memory, learning, coordination, movement control, and higher cognitive functions.
Got a burning question you want answered? Ask.
The last thing he said was the most important, in higher cognitive functioning. Because all the other things were happening short term. Those are the things that happen in the moment when you're high. But the last thing was what we've been talking about. And it kind of was the throwaway line. You know, unless you really listened for it, you probably wouldn't have even heard it. All right. Next, I want to talk about the behavioral impact, and then we'll talk about the psychological part last. So I'll get it going. All right. So there is a phenomenon called amotivational syndrome. So people who do have decreased motivation as a result of smoking marijuana. And it doesn't affect everyone. People who have excess motivation or are amply motivated may not show. But for people who are already struggling to be motivated, they can really, it can be enough to slow them down. It's almost like having increased gravity. For some people, we increase the level of gravity to be enough to keep them moving at all. So some people will dispute this, say, I still do stuff. And what I say is, what stuff? So the stuff that gets done when you're high, it typically is the fun stuff that you want to do anyways. The stuff that you don't like to do, like homework, job searching, typically doesn't get done. And those things are important because those get you the other things that you do want. So people who smoke a lot of weed tend to have goals, but they have less achievement, less attainment of those goals, which can have a direct impact on their self-esteem because they're not seeing it as marijuana induced. You know, I was speaking earlier about this young man. This is the second summer that his friends all went off to college and he stayed home. And he's only smoking weed, you know? But again, people are moving on and he's feeling worse and worse about himself because he's not. So I always say that if you're just making it, especially if you're just making it, it may be enough to keep you from making it. And these are some, I don't know if you can read this, but this is a really, I think, effective ad because this kid is smoking, obviously, right? And the dog says, the dog wants him to take him out. So the guy says, can't you just walk yourself? Because he's too tired to get up. And you know what the dog says? You disappoint me. That's deep, right? Who wants to disappoint their dog? But it's that idea that, he's not hurting anyone, but he's disappointing mostly himself, because dogs don't talk. At least the ones I've had. These are some quotes from clients. It's a great thing to do if you don't want things to change. Right? It won't kill you, just your dreams. And again, it's significant from what you don't do. Now, if people smoke a lot of weed, and that's what they do, that becomes their primary activity, they just chill and smoke weed, there's a problem in that. It's because what aren't they doing? But also, they're telling the brain that it can stop being plastic because we're doing everything we need to do. We can kind of close down. So people who stop having novel activities and challenges, the brain's reduced its plasticity window earlier. Yes?
I think that was
it?
topic, yeah.
Good. I knew I could. And the connection to boredom. A lot of times young people complain about being bored. When you were, let's see, how old would you have been? You were 10 years old and you went to your mother and you said, Mom, I'm bored. What did she say?
Go outside.
Go find something to do, right? She was basically saying, that was,
Figure it out.
yeah, it's your job to figure this out. Now we would call that free-range parenting, right? But there was some wisdom in that, is that, you can solve this, you should solve this. And now we kind of dictate what our kids do so much, and actually they end up being less creative as a result, right? But what happens with weed is they're not bored because they found something. Weed is a great cure for boredom, absolutely. I will tell you that all day. If you smoke weed, you won't be bored. But you're on the stoop, you are sitting with your friends at the basketball court, and you're on the bench, and you're bored, you smoke a blunt, you're not bored, what changed? Same bench, same friends, nothing. Your perception changed. And again, I would say that it's better to change your circumstances than just change the way they look, right? It's better to do something different because the act of getting out and experiencing new things, challenging yourself, is how we grow. We find out what we're interested in, we find out what our passions are, what we're good at, and maybe we'll turn that into a career, right? We become more interested in the world and thus more interesting. I work with a lot of kids, different ethnicities, races, sizes, ages, and I'll tell you, the people who smoke a lot of weed all start to look the same. Even though objectively they look very different, they take on a similar persona. It kind of rounds off the edges. So in some ways, if someone's annoying, it makes them easier to be around. But those edges are what make you you. That's what makes you unique. And when we round the edges, everyone seems kind of similar, right? So we have more blobs. And I had this mother come up to me recently and she said, my son, he's really just not doing anything. I always ask him, how does he feel? And he says, Mom, I don't feel anything. And he was saying that to get her off his back, but that made her more concerned, right? So the connection to boredom, let's see. The link, the psychological and emotional impact. This, I'm going to talk about the first one briefly, but then the other ones I think is the most profound thing that I'm going to share with you. So there is a connection, a demonstrated connection to schizophrenia and psychotic disorders. It doesn't mean if you smoke weed you're going to turn psychotic. If that were the case, there'd be a lot of psychotic people in this room, including me, right? But it's not the case. It means that some people have an increased risk for developing psychosis as a result of marijuana smoking. And if you think about it like this, many people have vulnerabilities to things that they're unaware of. Some of us know our vulnerabilities and some of us don't, right? But if you don't know you have one or you do have one and you're smoking marijuana, you're actually tipping the scales. Because marijuana is a drug that is changing your perception of reality. Well, that is what psychosis is. You have a different view of reality than the rest of us. And so if you're someone that's just teetering on the edge, you may never have had that manifest itself in your life. Fortunately, maybe you didn't have a trauma, you lived a healthy life, but if you smoke marijuana, it might be just enough to tilt it. And it's been demonstrated in study after study that there is a causal link between the two. Now, they don't know if it's actually psychosis or schizophrenia or it's just a syndrome that mirrors it. But if it walks like a duck, if it's the same. Good news, though, is they said with remittance, people were able to rebound, in at least some documented cases. So those are the people that probably wouldn't have had it otherwise. Let's see. I think I have a slide on that. Oh, so this is some more information about that you'll get, and this is just some of the studies where it came from. All right, but see, since 2002, a series of 10 studies have reported that individuals who use cannabis at the baseline evaluation had a greater risk of subsequently developing psychotic symptoms and full-blown schizophrenia than non-users. So it's shown up repeatedly. Again, it's a small risk, but for the people who it happens to, there's probably nothing that could be worse.
I heard the director of NIDA speak recently. She said it's a 6 times greater risk, and that if someone is genetically predisposed to marijuana, that schizophrenia, that never using marijuana basically takes it as if you don't have the genetic predisposition, then your levels are equal.
Same to the general population. So that's pretty significant. Again, it's still, the numbers are small because the overall risk for it is small. But again, for the people who have it, and if it's someone that has a family history or has had early symptoms, and early symptoms of schizophrenia, again, they typically manifest themselves in late adolescence, early adulthood, can be like seeing shadow figures or hearing hushed voices. It doesn't have to be anything real discreet. It could just be a sense. And the reason that young people report them to me is because it concerns them. They have a sense that other people aren't seeing them, right? I had a kid tell me recently, he feels like when he wakes up, someone's pushing on his chest. He knows someone's not, and he knows that's not an experience other people have. That's, but the irony, I don't know if irony is the right word, but People who have symptoms typically smoke more. They are at risk for smoking to alleviate the symptoms, which puts them at greater risk for developing them. So it's problematic both ways. All right, so this is very interesting to me. This is a pro-marijuana ad. It says marijuana is a crutch. Well, yeah, crutches help. Okay, that's how you could see it, but I don't want to always have to use crutches, right? But that's interesting because that's a positive, and I see that as a negative thing. It's a matter of perspective. It also can increase apathy. So people who are already somewhat apathetic can increase their apathy, and people who are just slightly apathetic, it can increase it. So if you smoke marijuana, one of the benefits is you don't get affected by stuff as much. I had a kid tell me that his father started smoking marijuana for medical uses, and he's never liked his father as much. He said his father is less aggravating. He's less anal about stuff. He doesn't care when the house is a mess. So this is a benefit. But his father cares less about this stuff. So you keep taking that, caring less. You care less and less. It might engulf some things that you do want to care about, right? So it can have this dulling effect. I had this young man say to me recently, he used to smoke a lot of weed. He recently got on a program and he's not smoking now. And I said, well, what would be different if you were? And he said, well, I probably wouldn't be here for one. And then he said, I'd probably be sitting here like this. And he leans back in his chair and just demonstrated being much more lethargic. The other thing is that you have natural cannabinoids. Remember in that video it said? The more you smoke, the less your body produces them. Because it doesn't have to. You're providing them externally. So you have less natural cannabinoids. And this is why there are conflicting studies. It shows that marijuana improves depression in short term, so people feel better when they smoke. Unfortunately, in long-term use, in heavy use, it actually makes depression worse. And that's why you get the conflicting studies. The other thing is that the developmental tasks, like coping, you're not developing them, right? You're using marijuana, so presumably you'll always need marijuana or something else. Let's see. This is, it's pretty hard to see this, but this is the graph that illustrates that as the longer you smoke, the highs decrease over time. People will recognize that. What they often don't recognize is that the down, where you are when you're not high, is also decreasing. So this person is B baseline where they start. D, they're functioning a little above depression. Thank you. Over time, what's happened is their baseline now is dipped below depression. So this person who's smoking to feel better is over time making themselves feel worse. I showed this to a young woman recently, and surprisingly she said, oh yeah, that's happened to me. And so I was surprised because she wasn't defensive. And I said, so what do you do? And she said, totally earnestly, she said, well, I smoke when I get up, and then I smoke during the day, and I smoke right before I go to bed. So she's she's aware of this, but she's trying to outrun it. So when she's depressed, she's feeling it most. All right, you can get the lights. All right. Oh, shocking. All right, so this idea of using to cope for negative emotions, then you're not learning to do it on your own. I've said that about 4 times because I really want you to take that home. It blunts emotions, right? So people who have sharp emotions, difficult emotions, negative emotions, when you smoke weed, it is very effective at making them less poignant. So if I'm someone who's challenged by my emotions, I have a lot going on. Remember I said as teens, they're feeling them more sharply, and I smoke weed, I'm still cognitively aware of what's bothering me. Unlike another drug that would just take me away completely, marijuana, I'm still cognitively aware of what's bothering me, but I don't feel the sting of the emotion. This is a major benefit of marijuana in a lot of young people's minds. Unfortunately, this causes a long-term problem. Because remember I said earlier, one of the goals of development is integrating your intellectual and emotional selves. And marijuana is actually consciously putting a barrier between them, so they can think and not feel. The problem with that is over time, they feel less. And when your feelings, your emotions, say these are 2 people and their fingers represent their emotions, the way we really connect intimately with people is through our emotions. People who are closing themselves off from their emotions, right? This is what happens when we try to connect. The people on this side feel the disconnect. This person might not even know what they're missing, right? That mother who said to her son, she's concerned that he's not feeling anything, right? She can't reach him. He's not noticing. He thinks, well, I'm good. But when I ask young people, do you feel as close to people as you would like? And they look at me with that like, no, that I never thought it was connected to marijuana, right? That's pretty profound. So what they're doing is they're disconnecting from their emotions, and then by virtue disconnecting from other people. Emotions is what gives life meaning. That's what separates us, right? From animals and from, well, certainly from machines, right? That we connect, even the difficult ones. make us appreciate the better ones. And one of the reasons, this is coming out recently, I sent Paul this study, the one on oxytocin. So oxytocin, you've probably heard of in recent years, is the love drug. It's the one when you pat your dog, that both the dog and you get a release of oxytocin. When you hug someone that you care about, you release oxytocin. It's one of those neurochemicals that is associated with connectivity. Well, oxytocin in the short term is increased. In the long term, heavy use, it actually decreases. So if you look at people who smoke a lot of weed, they often look disconnected. I had this woman come up to me in a training, she was an adult, and she said, I can't believe you were describing my husband. And I said, I didn't mean to. And she said, I've been married to this guy. He was an MIT trained scientist. He's brilliant. He smoked marijuana ever since I've known him. And he's a good provider. She said, but I felt alone in our marriage. And this explained it to her, because he was emotionally disconnected. Right? That's kind of a big deal. I'll use Chris, my last anecdote. Chris, the kid I told you about with Connor's dad, he was this major proponent, never saw anything wrong with it. He came to meet me every week without missing. He really used the time well. He had a lot of trauma history, really trying to gain insight, but continued to smoke weed, but he never smoked when he came to see me. I asked him to do that, and he never did. And so I said to him one day, Chris, who is the only person who has never been with you when you've been high? And he said, you. I knew that, because he smoked pervasively. And I said, let me ask you another question. Who do you think has the highest opinion of you, of anyone in your life? And I also knew he would say me. And he said, you. And then he went, oh no. Because he didn't want to connect those two things. So what was that about? Because I was interacting with the real him, the authentic him. The high you isn't the real you. The high you is the altered you, right? And to be real and authentic is really a goal. To be real, to embrace all of our parts. The good, the bad, the warts, everything, right? And when you're getting high all the time, you're not really living the life of who you are meant to be. So in youth culture, being real is considered one of the most complimentary things you can call someone. So it's also how we really connect. Right? So I'll leave it at that and leave some little time for questions. Questions?
Can you comment on any research about vaping and using oil and how that changes?
So the benefit of vaping or smoking like an e-cigarette, right, is to not get the smoke, negative effects of the smoke. So you're getting the vapor right pre-combustion. So it does minimize the effects from the tar and smoke, but you're still getting the effects of the THC. And a lot of times you're getting more of an effect because it's coming in an oil. So when you smoke a blunt or a joint, you can titrate that. You kind of know how long it's taking you to get high. You know it's taking you a while. But when you do it in an oil form, it's usually much more high potent. And people are having really detrimental effects, especially from the oils, because again, they're taking much more than they're accustomed to, and it's much harder to regulate. But they're not minimizing any of the effects from the THC. In fact, they're usually exacerbated. But again, it's harm reduction in the sense that they're not getting the harm from the smoke. And lots of people are trying to extract the oil and are causing lots of problems. People are burning their houses down. It's very, Yes?
One thing that I would say is that if you have a student that's using a vaporizer, there are vaporizers that you can put plant matter into. But if you have a kid that is using oil, you have real cause for concern. Because the word on the street right now is that plant matter is taboo and it's just the old people and we're the only ones that use it. And the kids want the concentrates. And to make 2 ounces of hash oil, you need a pound of marijuana. So you can see how concentrated. And when we use it in cancer patients, when we use the oil, they use 1 gram a day, which is the size of a grain of rice.
Right.
So if you know anybody that's using oils, we have a problem. So I just want to put that out there.
Thank you.
I already mentioned I was at a recent presentation, and one of the things that really made an impact on me was the presenter was talking about marijuana being the only drug, including alcohol and maybe even cigarettes, I can't remember, that has these risks, even if you're just using it very casually and you're never really like addicted or a chronic user, like one being schizophrenia and one being maybe IQ effects. I can't remember what the what the risks were. And you didn't say anything about that. Most of your information was about like chronic heavy use. What would you say about casual use for teens, older teens, whatever?
If they have a vulnerability and it kicks it in, I guess it wouldn't matter if you did it once or 100 times, right? I knew a young woman, well, she's a friend of a friend's family, and the story goes, she's now in her 40s and she has been in and out of institutions and hospitals, and she's 400 pounds. Like, she went to UMass Amherst, right near here, right? Her first weekend, this is the story the family tells, she smoked marijuana and had a break. And they say that it must have been laced. However, no one else at the party had that break, so clearly she had a vulnerability and it only took once. But again, that's not the experience of most people. Most people have seen hundreds of people smoke and no one having that experience. So typically, whatever the detrimental effect is, having periods of sobriety is going to help mitigate that, unless it's something that kicks off schizophrenia. The IQ thing is still interesting because it does look like heavy early use is what does it. But again, if you're killing brain cells and then you have periods of sobriety, your brain cells will regenerate. But if you're constantly assaulting them, you're never getting a chance to catch up. So yeah, I certainly, if it were up to me, no one would smoke, but less is better than more, definitely. And later is better than early.
How would you handle, and Karen and I do the ESPR, how would you handle like a student, a high school student saying that they do use the marijuana and we we say, it's not a good thing to do, we go in our little lecture, so to speak, but they say that, I'm only using it a few times, a week or whatever, and we say, well, just try to cut down. We really are discouraged, to use, it's illegal and it does destroy brain cells. But what if they come back and say, yeah, well, they regenerate.
Right.
I've truthfully have never heard that brain cells regenerate.
Yeah, they do.
Once they're gone, they're gone.
That's what they used to think, and now they do regenerate at a slower rate than other cells, but they do come back. Good news, right?
Mm-hmm.
But again, if you're constantly killing, say 50,000 grow back and you're killing 75 a day, you're going to create a deficit over time.
Yeah.
But we also want them to know that if they stop, their body can regenerate, because
Right.
that's important, especially if they stop during this era,
Right.
this time of plasticity. But yeah, any amount is not good.
Right.
That's definitely true. I don't want to leave people with that. But more is worse. And the body is pretty resilient. And some people are more at risk, and people who are already struggling in some ways are more at risk for doing it and increasing their struggle.
Mm-hmm.
There were lots of people. I had a kid, he wrote a comment afterwards, and he said, I heard what you said, I understand it, but my cousin is in college right now and he's doing great and he smokes weed all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Again, there are people, there are outliers, and every negative effect doesn't hit every person. But we should know what the risk is for us. And that's why I don't debate them. I say, it's important for you to have all the information at your disposal and you can make the best decision.
Right.
But there's a lot of information out there. There is a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
We can give it to you. Like sometimes it's very effective to give young people. They may doubt adults, but sometimes when they read something,
Right.
They tend to put more weight in it.
Right.
All right. Any other questions?
No, I was going to say, if you do have anything that you send out, that would be very useful. Because I work with kids in groups and the same thing. They always want to talk about it, but I don't want to spend time because they just get into the debating of the different studies. That we don't want to do that. But if there was something to give them, to leave them with, and say, I just want you to see different.
Okay, two things I'm going to say on that. First one is I want to put in a plug. If you have young people that you're concerned about, there's a free hotline you can call. That's the number for teens and young adults, and they will help with referrals, with resources that are available, and they're really good resources people can use. And as far as written resources, I find it's better to look up cannabis than marijuana if you're looking for stuff, because you get more scientific stuff called when it's under cannabis. That's one. The other thing is the website called Partners for a Drug-Free America, or drugfree.org. Has a couple different names. It's the same website. You go to that site, they're a clearinghouse for all things to do with substance abuse, and they'll keep you really current. And you can sign up to get their emails once a week, and you'll get all the legislation that's passed, all the latest studies. And they have a search that you can find lots of good information on. All right, well, thank you. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.